friends are synths.
Hello! Today I'm going to be talking about the use of visual art, or at least the creation of visual art, using an application called Lumen. Lumen is a video synth which is available on Mac OS X. It's designed to kind of replicate or emulate analog style visual glitches and visual synthesis that you would find on other kind of hardware devices. The reason I'm talking about this is because recently I've been exploring the world of creating visuals a bit more. In the past I have used different kinds of hardware visual devices, mostly the boxes from Critter and Guitari. You might have seen my video recently where I used the ETC quite extensively to jazz up my jam videos. And part of the reason for this is that I think that I kind of get bored of really perfect looking videos, partly because I'm not very good at arranging things in such a way where you get a perfect aesthetic or whatever, but I do kind of like bold neon colours, grungy, faded things. As a photographer, I was always interested in film photography. Either way, the Lumen Video Synth is a fairly accessible way into this world of kind of analog style art or visual art, because a lot of the other things involve bits of hardware, old CRT screens, understanding the difference between PAL and NTSC or how they relate together, getting a whole bunch of different weird cables and adapters and things like that. And that is something that I might talk about at a later date. But Lumen allows you to do all this on your computer, or at least a lot of it on your computer. And it's something that I kind of looked down on a bit in the past, because if you're going to do something analog style, I don't really love doing it on a computer. I would much rather do it with hardware. But as it turns out, Lumen is actually a really useful and powerful tool. Today I'm going to talk a wee bit about Lumen, but also I'm going to specifically talk about how I used it or how we used it in a band I play with to put together a music video for our first single. I'll link that below. It's called Black Market Haircuts by a band called Hog Wyld, and I think the video is pretty cool, so I would go watch that. What I'm going to do is record my screen now and show you the Lumen Video Synth, how it operates, and whether, you know, if you're interested in creating visual glitchy art, then this might be a good place to start. There's a few things I should get out the way first. My camera is up here and the preview image is down here somewhere, and that means they're not aligned, and so if I go cross-eyed, that's why, because it's quite a weird setup to get used to. The second thing is, if you're wondering who these people in the background are, then this is my favourite Japanese band called Massive the Fermenting Dregs. They're well worth a look or a listen if you're not familiar with them. But in terms of synth itself, unfortunately, you can't change the resolution of this control panel. You can't full screen it. And whilst it's nice, it looks like it's designed to be like a desktop hardware synthesis module. It does pose a bit of a problem if you're on a bigger or smaller screen than a kind of standard-ish 13-inch size, because obviously if you're on a mini screen, then this is going to be bigger than the screen itself, and if you're on a much bigger screen, like I've got a 16-inch screen, then it doesn't take up as much real estate as you might like it to. So that's something to be aware of if you've got a weirdo screen size, or you know, are using an external monitor. On resolution, Lumen only handles SD, so it only works in standard definition and at an aspect ratio of what I think is 4:3. So 640 by 480 I think is correct. That means there's no 1920 by 1080, no 720p, no HD at all. And this is something that I've been told they're working on, an HD version. They have been working on it for a wee while, but I contacted the folk that make Lumen recently and asked them, and they said they're actively working on it. So hopefully in future that will be changed. But it is something to be aware of. If you're thinking you can feed in HD video into this, glitch it up, and then get an HD signal out, then you can't. Sorry. Onto the synth itself. There are basically three main components, or three main elements that you should be aware of. We've got the patch, we've got the knob section, and we've got the browse, which is presets. I'll briefly go into all of them and then show you how I used it with the video that my band put together. So the patch section, or the patch menu, is the most complicated. If you're familiar with modular synthesis, then this won't be all that frightening, or at least not initially, because then you realize that actually signal flow within the video world is very different, and it's a completely separate skill set. And as someone who understands a lot, or a fair amount, about modular synthesis, I am still very lost when it comes to video patching. This can be really powerful. You can create your patches in here and get all sorts of different effects. Like, I guess if we take this and patch it to there, you'll see that the RGB can be split into different ways. Pretty cool. But I have not spent a huge amount of time in here. It is quite complicated. But ultimately, this is where you're going to get the most interesting and unique results. Now, if you're like me and you're thinking, oh, well, that looks far too complicated, then luckily there are a whole selection of presets that come straight out of the virtual box. When you get Lumen, you can select different ones here. And they do all sorts of cool things. And you'll notice if you select different ones that the patch itself changes. So this can be a good way to learn how different things interact, how the different parameters interact. And a lot of them do kind of quite interesting, more traditional analog style synthesis, but also some other quite weird things. You can see that a lot of these are just kind of synthesized art or whatever, but you can also inject in video signals or use cameras, and I'll come on to that just in a wee bit. If you have the actual full version of Lumen rather than just the demo, then you can save your own presets and stuff. If you've just got the demo version, you can't save presets, so that's something to be aware of. You don't just have to go into the actual patch itself to modulate things. So just like in a modular synthesizer, whilst changing the signal flow will give you the most drastic results, there's also knobs and parameters that you can vary without changing the signal flow completely. And this is where the middle section comes in. We have a bunch of different knobs which control different features and different parameters. Here we have three different input sources, and these can be webcam or another kind of camera that you have plugged into your computer. It can be oscillators, where you can see I've changed the second input source here to an oscillator, and then you can change the various kinds of the kinds of modulation. You can change the frequency of the modulation. You can change the kind of sync it's got. You can change the mix level. You can change the color of the modulation, and of course the relationship. So you can quite quickly get some really interesting glitchy effects just by taking a preset and then adjusting it. And honestly, that's mostly what I've been doing so far. You can see that quite quickly as well, you can get into interesting and weird territory quite far away from where you began, and that's where the presets really come in handy, because quite often what will happen is you'll be playing around and you'll get to a point of no return, like you can't get back to where you were. So you can, in those situations where you find something that you like and you're like, oh, actually that's quite a cool effect, like this maybe, you can duplicate your current patch. See up there, it's Insta Vintage 3, and then if you go into presets, you'll see there's various different variations on this patch that I have created. It's a bit slow to switch when you've got an input source like that, but there you go. In terms of other effects, down here we have our kind of global effects, although whether or not they're global will depend on the patch, so maybe I should clarify that. If we look in the patch itself, you'll see that different sources can be routed into different effects. Now that'll make more sense when I show you this. For example, you can scale out the display and get like a nice tiled look here. You can also rotate the screen, which is pretty cool. The ones I like the best are the offset, so you can change the kind of vertical and horizontal offset depending on what patch you have. And then you've got this kaleidoscope function, which lets you do kind of wild fractal stuff and can get quite interesting pretty quickly. Trails basically is like a delay, or like a, you can see like a ghosting effect where any movement has a trail after it, and you can get rid of it by, you know, just resetting it back to 0. If you wanted the effect to modulate or affect all of your input signals, then you would need to route them into the relevant effect. So oscillator A is going into the trails, but we could also send oscillator B into trails. Oh, fuck. I guess you can't send them both in at once. Anyway, you get the idea. You basically change the parameters in here depending on what you want. Some of the patches you can affect all of the channels at once, and there's, you know, ways to do it. But my knowledge of this section is still work in progress. But that's the basics of how it works. In terms of the usefulness of this, you can, of course, just take something like one of these video synthesis patches and then modulate it, do crazy things to export or record the output of those visuals, and then overlay them into something like, you know, I don't know, Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere or whatever, and blend them in such a way that it'll give your existing footage that you have in there, you know, an interesting kind of glitchy look. But the thing that I like to do most of all with this is feed in external video sources, because that way you get the most control over how the effects interact with the footage itself. Now, of course, if you're on a laptop or like a standard standard computer, then you're only going to have one camera in here. And that means you can only kind of feed in your webcam usually. If you've got a third party like digital USB camera, that will also work, but most people will just have the HD, you know, FaceTime HD thing. Now, the way you can feed in external video footage into this is by using OBS, which is that application that's free. Every streamer and their dog uses it. It's not difficult to set up. If 12-year-old, you know, Minecraft streamers can set it up, then you can figure it out. So I'm not going to go into a tutorial or anything like that, but I will show you how it works. So basically what you do is you get OBS, and here we have, you know, kind of a video that I was playing about with, and I've got it kind of, let's just put it there. I've started a virtual camera down below. I've hit play on OBS. Then what will appear is, in here we'll have OBS virtual camera, and this means that I can route any kind of video into Lumen and then do all the effects and stuff with it, which is awesome because you get way more control over the kinds of look and stuff of things this way than you would if you were just exporting kind of glitchy visuals and then chucking them into Final Cut Pro. And you can begin to imagine how that might look in practice, especially with some of the weirder patches where you can really begin to glitch things together and play about with oscillators and stuff. I mean, how cool does that look? And this is the way I've been using it most of all, is feeding in external footage, recording a bunch of variations, and then seeing how it goes. What I'm sure you're probably asking is, well, that's awesome. Is there MIDI input control? And yes, there is. Basically, you can map your MIDI controllers to each of the parameters. Having an external MIDI controller allows you also to tweak multiple parameters at once, which looks awesome. There's a few caveats to be aware of about MIDI control. Whilst it is good, if you look at something like the rotate function here, or the rotate knob has a 360-degree kind of endless thing, and part of the fun of that is that you can go all the way around endlessly, you know. Same with the offset, where you can do quick round, unlimited, endless stuff. But if you use a MIDI encoder or a MIDI controller with Lumen, because it sends out CC values and that's what the synth responds to, it only goes from 0 to 127, and that means that you only get 0 to 360 degrees or 180, whatever it is. You don't get the full endless encoder thing where you can just spin round forever, and that's a shame. I did email, I think it's Jason who makes Lumen, and said, hey, is this something you're planning to implement? And he said, yes, we're looking at putting in endless encoder values so that if you have a MIDI controller that supports sending out endless encoder values, then you'll have much more control over it, and that'll make a big difference, I think. But for now, you're kind of a bit limited. But you can still do cool things with it, it's just not as fully controllable as if you were using the controller. So now you know how to stick your stuff in a Lumen and glitch it up or whatever. Then how do you record it? Well, there's a couple of different ways. You can either full screen the video itself and then record that using QuickTime Player. It's kind of a standard thing that people do. However, the problem with that is that you then, if you're using just a single screen, you can't then control Lumen in the same way that you would, because you can't see like the application. That's where the MIDI controller would come in really handy, but of course, as I mentioned, the MIDI CC implementation makes it a bit more limited. So one way you can do it and still have everything on the one screen is to use something called the Siphon Recorder. And this is just a wee bit of software that you can expand. It takes the footage out from Lumen and then you can record it. And that way you can arrange it on the screen so that you can see both at once, which is quite nice. Although when you start recording, actually Lumen, the output on this part disappears, which is a shame, and I don't know if I can change that. But that's one way to do it. It's probably the easiest way to get your footage out. If you have an external screen, this is probably the best way to do it, because then what you can do is full screen Lumen onto your second screen, use your main screen as the controller, and then you can just record your second screen and get the much bigger picture whilst having full control over the app itself. So in terms of how we used Lumen in practice for my band when we were putting together this video for the Black Market Haircut single that you can listen to and watch below, we were kind of constrained in what we could do physically because of the pandemic and all those associated problems. So what we found was a bunch of weirdo stock footage. Our guitarist and member of the band Lee put that together in an interesting composition with some, static and things like that. And then I took that footage and ran it into Lumen a bunch of times. We put it into a bunch of different patches, glitched it up, played about with the effects, exported I think about 6 or 7 different variations of the video with these kind of transitions that or effects that made sense with the music, and then Lee put it all together and kind of made it make sense as a cohesive whole. So to show you how that worked, we have OBS here. As I mentioned, it has the video, and then we just played it as a virtual camera. So we started the virtual camera, pressed play, and then the video came through here. Now what I'll have to do is engage OBS. And immediately you can see the output here. I had my Siphon recorder here, or sitting somewhere, and hit record, and that would grab the output. And then throughout the video I just played with the various parameters, like so. You can change the colors, can stick the trails on, and you can see quite quickly how you're able to kind of liven up your video footage a bit. And what I would suggest is that if you're interested in doing this, part of the magic is in the synthesis and the effects and everything else, but then really the key is how you blend it all together, because if you're just using Lumen in of itself, it's cool, but it's not going to give you the final package. Or if you do, it'll be a very specific look. The real kind of beauty of it is when you take the output and you blend it with some other things, some other modern effects, or maybe even other analog hardware or analog bits and pieces. So that's it. That's Lumen. That's how we used it in Hog Wyld for our debut video. That's what we used to get those effects, and hopefully you'll be compelled now to go and listen to it It should also be on Spotify. If you want to follow us on YouTube, we have literally 10 subscribers or something. So please do say hello, and hopefully you like the music. Also, let me know if you're interested in more of this visual synth stuff, because I have been experimenting more and more with it, as I mentioned, and I probably have a lot more to say as time goes on about different bits of hardware and different bits of software and all that kind of thing. Hopefully that was interesting. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Goodbye.